Welcome to Talking Jazz. My guest today is Jussi Reijonen, and I'm talking to him from Finland. So he's talking to me from Finland. I'm in Vienna, and we'll broadcast to the USA. We'll explore a new recording that he has out and a little bit of some older recordings. But it's a real treat to get to know his music and share it today. So welcome, Jussi.
Thank you for having me.
And the first thing I always am curious and like to know is a little bit of the background of you as a player. And you've lived in so many countries in the Middle East and East Africa and the US. So I'm kind of curious to hear from you, what got you in all these different countries and some of the things you take away from each, quick synopsis if that's possible.
So I'm born in a town called Rovaniemi on the Arctic Circle in northern Finland. My father, before he retired, he worked as a telecommunications engineer. So his work took us to first, when I was 6, my family moved to Amman, Jordan. Then we moved back to Finland for a while. Then we moved to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Then back to Finland. Then to Muscat, Oman, and from there to Beirut, Lebanon, and then back to Finland. So it was my childhood between age 6 and 15 was a lot of different cultural influences and moving between different environments very, very often. So I think that has been a very defining thing in my life as an individual, and also as a musician and composer. And then later, as an adult, I lived for 13 years in Boston and spent some time in New York as well. So it's been, I think, a journey that is in many ways audible in the music. The
Mhm.
music has been kind of, I think, my way of trying to make sense of the world.
Yeah, we certainly can hear that. I mean, it's amazing to get all these different influences together. And how long approximately did you get to spend in each of those countries during your childhood? Just curious.
Jordan was 2.5 years.
Mm.
Tanzania was 2.5 years. Oman was very brief. It was about 6 months, and then Lebanon was a little bit under a year.
Okay.
Altogether, about 6 years out of my education between first and ninth grade was living in these different countries altogether.
And that's, usually the formative years, meaning the influences that you hear at that time, they really form your preferences and what you're going to
Yeah.
do. So when did you pick up the guitar?
I was 13, so this would have been in between Tanzania and Oman. So when the family moved back to Rovaniemi in Finland for a little while, friends were playing guitar, and I'd always really enjoyed music that had guitar in it. I grew up on a lot of rock music from the 80s as a kid. So it seemed like a very natural choice given how prominent that instrument's role in that music was. So yeah, I was 13 or so.
Fascinating. So, we'll talk more about your background and spending time in the US too, but I'm curious if you can give us a little intro before we listen. So I have the reel first, which is from a brand new recording that you just put out, Kolme Toista, I have to say it right. It's on Challenge Records International, and it has quite a international cast of players on there too. So give us a little background on the players and this tune that we're going to listen to.
The new album is 3 seconds, Kolme Toista, and it's a 5 movement suite. So it's altogether it's about 42 minutes of music divided into 5 different movements. And the veil is the opening movement that introduces the beginning of the narrative that the suite reflects, and also all the musical elements that are there. So I think the musically speaking, there's a very, very strong influence from Arabic music and from different African traditions of music, and also jazz for sure. I would say there's a rock element in there, and also of this quote unquote European art music. When I started to compose this suite, the music started to ask for certain instruments. I was originally writing for a quartet, quintet, but then as I kept listening to what was coming out in as I was scoring the music, it seemed to want a more expanded instrumentation. And then once the instrumentation became clear, I realized that all of the parts were asking for very specific players who I have with most of them very, very long history of playing together since going back to 2009 or so from different other projects. So I play fretted and fretless electric guitar on the whole album, and also classical guitar and Arabic oud. Then we have Jason Palmer from the United States on trumpet and flugelhorn, Bulut Gulen from Turkey on trombone, Laith Sadiq from Jordan/Iraq on violin, Nassim Alatrash from Palestine on cello, Utar Artun from Turkey on microtonal piano, Kyle Miles from the United States on fretless electric and also upright bass, Keita Ogawa from Japan on percussion, and Vansel Cooper from the United States on drums.
Fascinating. So let's have a listen to that first one, and then I'll ask you a little more about your instrumentation, fascinating instrumentation and your players. So this is the wheel from 3 Seconds from a brand new album called Kolme Toista on Challenge Records by my guest today, who you'll hear also on guitar, Jussi Reijonen. Here we go. That was The Wheel from a brand new album, 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista on Challenge Records International. And it's by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen, who you also heard on guitar, and he's the composer. And we just learned about this multicultural background and what an experience. You know, in the States, they call them the army brats who get to move around and get to be stationed in all these different things. But your dad being telecom helped, you know, get you in all these different places. And, you know, what we heard on the recording is a very interesting set of instruments and coming from all these different countries. How did you get to know all these various players, and how did you put this together and brought them all in one space, or not?
Yeah, I mean, these are all people that I consider to be family to me. We've played in different configurations over the years. I met all of them during my time in Boston and New York when I was living there. So a lot of the roots of this collaboration can be traced to either Berklee College of Music, where I was studying, or New England Conservatory, or then just freelancing in the music scene on the East Coast. Yeah, like I said before, it was very clear as I was listening to what the music, or I should say what I understood the music to be asking for, that it really wanted very, very specific players. I joke with the guys that none of them left me with any choice. It had to be these gentlemen who play on the album. Also because the music has so many different influences from different traditions, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Europe, from the United States, that it wouldn't really have been possible, as I felt at least, to have different players on this. I was really going for some way of expressing these influences in a balanced way, because I felt like it makes sense in my head, but it took many, many, many years to get to a place where they started to find a balance in my head. And then it was a question of, how do I bring that kind of a sound out into the world? So all the players had to be first deep as human beings, and who would resonate with the narrative of the suite, and have that kind of personal empathy, and also the kind of musical and artistic depth to play this music, and also to bring their own voices to it. So that's something that I found when I had then, as I was writing, and I then contacted everybody, and fortunately everybody agreed to do this, and they were very enthusiastic about it, that then composing and arranging became such a joy, because I could really imagine that, okay, I need a bass line here. I know Kyle Miles is playing bass, and that inspires me to write for Kyle as a person and as a player. It was very much the latter, I'd say, 4 months of writing the suite was very much writing for these particular musicians. So regarding getting everybody together, I have to say that was a practical challenge, because it was done during the height of the COVID lockdowns. And having had the very logistically bright idea to do a non-net recording, first of all, in any scenario, but especially during COVID, it was a challenge. I had to find a large enough studio that was large enough that we could distance if needed. Everybody had to get tested and everything like this. So, but regardless, that being said, it just so happened that 8 of us 9 were able to record live. So we recorded at Power Station New England in Connecticut. And then Bulut Gulen, our trombone player, unfortunately wasn't able to come to the United States because of travel restrictions and things like this. So he recorded his trombone parts later in Istanbul. And I remotely produced that session from Boston. So it was kind of, it was a very strange, fascinating experience to, in many ways, because on one hand, it was odd to be, again, after so long, to be playing live with human beings. I think that added to the energy and the enthusiasm that was in the room as we were working on the music. We were just excited to be with each other again. And then on the other hand, it was really fascinating what was possible technologically, that I can produce a session that Bulut is recording in Istanbul and I'm on the other side of the ocean in Boston. So it was quite an experience to put this together.
You know, it's so true. The things we took out of this pandemic thing, it's a whole different way of music making, a whole different way of relating to each other, and a whole different way of thinking about the meaning of music too, and what it means to be able to, you know, what we treasure now is that ability much more than before the experience of not being able to do it. So
I think one thing that happened because of the COVID related circumstances was that the album became much more through composed than
mm,
I had imagined it to become, because I was really scoring the music, and for me to hear the ideas and experiment with the ideas, I was just alone in a basement for months and months and months and months, or then in Finland at a cottage for a few months writing. So because I didn't have the luxury of that in-person interaction of and experimentation with the guys, it was just not possible. It became much more kind of written out piece. But that being said, there is still a lot of improvisation in every movement from all of us, and everybody, I think, was able to really bring their own voice to it.
yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing, to be able to provide as much guiding material as possible. So it's a very special thing, actually, especially being in a little cottage in Finland. And I'll ask you about that too. But let's have a listen to this second one, Transient. Anything specific to point the listener to in this one?
Well, the second movement is very much contrast in its approach to the veil that opens the album. So there are no horns. This is very much centered around percussion and very, very much influenced by Khaliji music from the Persian Gulf. So there's a lot of elasticity to the rhythms and very microtonal as well. So you'll hear an opening from our violinist, virtuoso violinist Laith Sadiq, doing an open improvisation, very Arabic microtone saturated phrasing there, and then he leads us from the end of the veil into Transient, which everything is built on an E half flat microtone and goes from there. So there's an oud call which I play, and then from there violoncello and the oud take the melodic roles, and everything else is just a lot of drums and percussion, and then bass supports it. So it's a very rhythmic piece, and I think this is one of my favorite moments of the entire suite, is how Transient turned out.
Well, thank you for that information. That's very informative and helps. So let's have a listen. So this is Transient, 3 seconds, Kolme Toista on Challenge Records International by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen. 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista, on Challenge Records by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen, who I'm talking to. And we already learned a lot about these different elements and rhythmical, musical influences. The next one we're going to go to is the Weaver, which I would say is a little bit more traditional guitar playing, the way it starts out with the pattern. Then there's some interesting shifting harmonies. And you were talking earlier also about the microtonal aspects. So I'd be curious, from your US, Finland, Middle Eastern, African, what do you think are the most important lessons you took from each of these regions to musically, or, I mean, it's tricky, but maybe something stick out that came especially from various regions?
There's so much. I mean, I've been so fortunate to just have had the exposure to these cultures and these environments. Also, really, really fortunate to have been able to study with many of the greats of these different traditions, whether that's been Goodrick for jazz guitar, or Simon Shaheen, Bassam Saba, Najib Shaheen for the Arabic oud. It's a very broad question, so I don't think I'll be able to say a very definitive, concise answer, but I think all I can really say is that it's really enriched my perception of the world and perception of music and how people express themselves and how we communicate with one another. I think for me, what I shudder to say European, because it's a very umbrella term that is, I think, should be parsed way more in detail, but in the sense that a lot of the harmonic approach that I take to chords and things like this, there's definitely an influence from what could be traced to different European traditions of working with harmony, but filtered through how it's used in American jazz. I think there's a lot of, on this album, I think there's a lot of influence from Dmitri Shostakovich and his string quartets in particular. I think there's a lot of Sibelius in certain ways. From the Middle East, I think there's something about the sound of Arabic maqam. And for me in particular, when I hear it being performed on the Arabic oud or violin or cello, which neither one of those instruments are traditionally native to that tradition, but they've been in later years used a lot, whether it's been with Kulthum and her ensembles or later artists. There's many examples of that, but there's something about the phrasing, the breath, the microtonality, and the way that intonation is used in Arabic music is incredibly deep as a resonance when I listen to it. And there's many things there that I can relate to blues as well, that blues is a microtonal music, and how intonation is being used as an expressive tool also there, but with a different kind of syntax. Jazz as well. I mean, if you listen to horn players, you listen to Billie Holiday, great vocalists, there's a lot of expressive depth in just intonation and phrasing. Then from the Persian Gulf area, I think if you listen to the rhythms of Khaliji music, the elasticity of time and how they stretch things, like Transient is a very, very good example of that influence in my music, which also goes to my fascination with hip hop and listening to how hip hop artists play with phrasing, rhythm, accenting, emphasis, time, whether it's Jay-Z or Kendrick Lamar or Jay Dilla. I mean, there were many things like in some of the scores, I would have these references for the guys, something like think Jay Dilla or things like this, because rhythm has always been a very central element for me. I think I instinctively understood, and I think in some ways still understand rhythm better than I understand melody or harmony. Why that is, I don't exactly know, but it's something, it seems a bit more primary in the way that I interact with music. From Tanzania, I think there what really fascinates me is particularly Zanzibari music, tarab, how that really brings together influences from the Middle East and the Levant, or Persian Gulf, and also African influences, and how those create something completely new. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of also from American music growing up on rock. There's somebody told me just recently that what they hear, especially with the third movement, the Weaver, every so often shifting the sands beneath her, that they hear Alice in Chains. To me, I'd never even thought about it, but my friend, who was an incredible guitarist, he just said that that chord pattern, the kind of bitonal chords that are played over this bass vamp that again has a microtone in there, that he thought that that was straight up Alice in Chains, and I hadn't even thought about it, but it makes a ton of sense because to me, Dirt, Jar of Flies, the self-titled album, I mean, that's really like mother's milk. There's a lot of these influences that have come together, particularly in this music, and I think putting this together, I finally took off all filters about what I should or should not do. I just instinctively, these things resonate with me. Let me see how those influences can be channeled into something, hopefully.
I love that description that you took away the filters, because as a jazz artist, that's what it's all about, to bring these unique things that you have to the table. We don't have to do anything that the jazz police says, since this is how things work, but we need to move the music forward and share what we can contribute. So that's really great way of expressing that.
And if I look at, the room where I'm speaking to you from, on my walls, I have photographs of artists. I have Paco de Lucia in front of me, huge innovator, huge influence, flamenco music, I should have mentioned as well. Paco and Camarón de la Isla in particular. Jimi Hendrix here, you don't see it on the camera, and Kulthum and Mohammed Al-Kasabji in the back. Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Miles, Mingus. There's so many artists that I feel that the ones that have spoken to me the most, they've really been somewhat iconoclastic in that they've really done something very, very unique, but they've also had a very clear foundation depth to it. I've always really, really appreciated music that is somehow very, very itself. That can be Björk or whoever. I mean, I just have a lot of respect for people who found some unique voice in what they do.
I completely agree. And I think this is a great way to listen to your next piece from that suite, The Weaver, with the shifting sands on the bass line. So let's have a listen to The Weaver from the new album, 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista, by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen. That was the Weaver from a new recording, suite composed by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen, and published on 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista. And we have 3 of the 5. We'll get 2 more from that suite. We talked about the multi-ethnic, multicultural background, but you do live in Finland. And, you know, I think thinking about my listeners in the US, there's certain things you think about in Finland, lots of empty space and cold and long tones. Give us a little bit about insights on the music scene actually in Finland, working as an artist in Finland.
Well, actually, I don't live in Finland. I live in Amsterdam right now.
Ah, well, there you
But-
go.
So, I left Finland in 2008 to move to Boston, and then New York, Boston, and now a bit over a year ago moved to Amsterdam. So I'm now closer to the Finnish music scene geographically, but I don't necessarily feel that I can speak so much about the music scene because I've been for so long away, except that what I've noticed in the time since I left is that it's definitely become a lot more diverse in terms of the influences that people bring. Also, as Finland gets more multicultural, as most countries are doing these days.
So let's talk about this a little more, but we'll have verso. What should we focus on this one when we listen to?
In many ways, it recaps a lot of the themes that were introduced in the Veil. I mean, the whole suite is essentially theme and variation through the whole 5 movements. So you'll hear what was a cello theme in the Veil now is played on classical guitar. And then from there, this movement is, I think, a lot more joyful in a sense. There's a certain mystery at the heart of the Veil and a certain discomfort with how much dissonance there is and a certain question or a knot that needs to be resolved. Verso refers to turning over a new leaf or a new page. So in Finnish, verso means to sprout or to grow. So this is having gone through a certain kind of coming to terms with a certain knot and starting to understand where it comes from. This is now coming to the other side of that and starting to unentangle that, if that's the word. So I find this very uplifting, and there's you'll hear after an initial chaos shock type of section, you'll hear it settle into a groove that's very influenced by music from Mali, specifically Tumani Diabate's Symmetric Orchestra and Salif Keita and Umu Sangare and a lot of these kinds of artists that I've listened to quite a bit. So I had in the score, I think I'd written Mali funk as a vibe for the guys. So you'll hear solos. There's a lot of trading between Laith Sadiq on violin and Jason Palmer on trumpet. You'll hear a percussion solo from Keita Ogawa. And you'll also hear Uttar Artun, our pianist, play a microtonal piano solo. We used a friend of mine from Finland, Kari Ikonen, who's a great pianist. He invented these tuning devices for grand piano that they're called macchiano, like makam and piano, macchiano, that you install on the strings of a piano without harming the instruments. So you can actually even slide them on the strings. So it changes the vibrating length of the string. So we could tune certain notes of a piano to C quarter sharps that otherwise wouldn't have necessarily been as easy to do. So you'll hear Uttar really highlighting that microtone, which also was present in the Veil and in the Weaver, that C quarter sharp. It's really comes through. And then at the end, you'll hear a recap of the original theme from the Veil again before the violin takes the tune out.
So this is Verso from the new album 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista, by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen, guitarist and also composer. That was Verso from the new album 3 Seconds, Kolme Toista, by my guest today, Jussi Reijonen on guitar, composer. We'll close actually, but the track previously recorded on Naima, John Coltrane's Naima. And it's a very different take on Naima than you usually do. So before we say goodbye, tell us a little bit your thoughts behind this take on John Coltrane's Naima.
Yeah, this is a one take live in the studio version from my first album, that came out in 2013. Coltrane, for me, has been a very interesting presence. Again, going to the aesthetic of space, I think that was very much on my mind when I was working on the music for back in the day. Very spacious arrangement, a lot of silence, a lot of working with tension resolution with sound and silence. The rhythm, it's based on one repetitive, almost like a ritualistic rhythmic chant that I used some Indian rhythmic concepts to put this together. I really love how we captured this in one take. It was one of these things we tried it a second time and it wasn't the thing. This
one more Naima from the album and this is by my guest Jussi Reijonen, who you heard explaining how to listen to it, the background on guitar also. Thank you, Jussi.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Talking Jazz. My guest today was composer and guitarist Jussi Reijonen. You can hear Talking Jazz every Thursday at 11 a.m. and Mondays at 7 p.m. on WETF 105.7 in South Bend, Indiana, or online at jazzradiowetf.org, and Fridays at 8 p.m. on WICR 88.7 Indianapolis. Previous shows are also on my YouTube channel, Monika Herzig, MonikaHerzig. Please subscribe to the Talking Jazz playlist. Thank you for listening.